All right, so let's talk about the peer review process. So this is once you have your article all written, you have all the studies you need, you have it all typed up, formatted, you've gone through everything to submit it, and now it is in the hands of the people at the journal. So who gets this paper? The types of people that are going to see this usually first are going to be an action editor or some kind of administrative assistant or person at a journal. The sort of editorial structure of a journal is usually that there are one, sometimes two or three editors that run the journal, essentially. And those people have an editorial board that are, depending on the size of the journal, going to be pretty involved in the direct decision making that has to do with what papers are going to be accepted. And usually editors, they're taking on some of that job themselves. So they maybe have the final decision on something, but generally they're going to trust their editorial board and those people serving as action editors to do their jobs too. Action editors specifically are the people that handle the decision on an individual paper. They're the people that are, I guess, seeing the action, doing the action. I'm not totally sure the etymology of where that phrase comes from, but they're the people that are making the final decision, sending out the decision letters about if a paper is rejected or accepted or needs revisions or whatever. But again, your action editor might be the actual main editor of a paper, might be some other person on the editorial board or an associate editor or something, but that's the kind of the corresponding person for you at the journal once you have a submission. The action editor's job is to determine whether your paper is sufficient for publication at their journal. So they, or sometimes an assistant of some kind, are looking through all the papers and just trying to decide, first of all, does this meet some minimum threshold of quality? And if it doesn't, then those papers are summarily rejected without being reviewed. That's called a desk rejection. I don't really have an estimation of how often that happens. I think for the most part, when people are submitting work to these journals, it's a lot of trouble to do it, so people aren't messing around and submitting low quality stuff most of the time. But the higher up you go, and if you're submitting papers to Science or Nature or the top journal in your field or something, there's probably going to be more desk rejections just because more people are trying to aim high and it might not always work out. The next step after an action editor decides that your paper is good enough to at least be considered is that they kind of look around in the subject area and try to decide on some people that should review your paper. So if your paper is on the association between racial attitudes and eyewitness testimony, they're going to they're not just going to pick the first three names in their reviewer pool. They're going to think about who does research on eyewitness memory, who does research on the impact of racial attitudes on legal processes, who does X, Y, and Z research that actually connects to that type of work, or who at least has expertise in those areas. So they are going to pick usually two or three. Usually they start with three. Reviewers that are going to read a paper very, very carefully and give detailed feedback on that paper. I say usually two or three here because kind of the gold standard, the usual is three, but then sometimes if a reviewer takes a long time, they might just not. They might say, hey, you know what, actually don't worry about it. We have two people's opinions. We have enough to make a decision. So this happens because, keep in mind, reviewers are totally volunteer positions. Reviewers are just other authors. And there is, I guess I wouldn't even say an unwritten rule because a lot of people don't follow it, but a lot of people talk about your review debt, that you should be giving as many reviews as you get. That if you submit a paper and you get 3 reviews on it, you should be reviewing 3 papers to keep this kind of system going, because it's just people volunteering their time basically and volunteering their expertise as scientists to review these different papers. Action editors and editors, they get sometimes it is a volunteer position, just to go with the experience and expertise and prestige that comes from it. But sometimes there's like a modest stipend that comes with it too. But reviewers are totally volunteer work. So when people have a month to review it and they keep getting extensions or something, it's not ideal, and you'd hope people wouldn't do that, but things happen, right? Yes. Once the reviewers have given their feedback to the action editor looks at all of it, weighs all of it, thinks to themselves, what is the balance of this feedback? Should we move forward with this paper, or should we not? But basically, they have a form letter, that they fill out, and then they put lots of detailed comments, usually if you have a good action editor, in kind of summarizing what the reviewer said and what the things that they think are really important for the authors to change. That decision letter is going to have one of 3 possible outcomes, and 3 here is almost kind of a joke, that usually it's going to be one of 2 possible outcomes. You could theoretically have a letter that comes back to you that says, this paper is accepted. I am not aware of that ever actually happening. I'm sure it has, but it is exceedingly rare that no one is going to have any problems with your paper. One thing about reviewers, they're volunteering their time. They're generally not going to have no issues with a paper or not want to share their advice on it, so there's always going to be a long list of things to change about a paper. The 2 things that are more likely to happen, a positive outcome, is an invitation to revise and resubmit your paper, colloquially called in the field an R&R. So it's good to have an R&R. It's more work. You have to change things, and you might have to change things that you think are very stupid. But it is, a sign that you're on the right track. Or after review, you might just get a rejection letter. And obviously this happens, and it's never very fun, but it is just kind of part of the process. There's not room for every single paper, and a lot of times you still get the comments, obviously, from reviewers, so you're getting good feedback to improve it for the next journal that you're going to try to send it to. So just so you have kind of an idea of what these actually look like, I've put some excerpts from some decision letters that I've actually gotten, so some rejection and some R&R letters. Here's one, the review of your manuscript. Let me double check, make sure I know which one this is about. Yes, this one is about a paper that I wrote that has to do with how racial attitudes impacted perceptions of how fair U.S. elections are in 2008 and 2012, which I thought was a very cool paper, and we did eventually get it published, my co-author and I. When we first sent it to one of the top political science journals, and we got this letter back. The review of your manuscript is now complete. The referee reports are appended, blah, blah, blah. As you will see, the recommendations are mixed. Referee 1, reviewer 1, is quite positive about the paper and makes minor suggestions. 3 is also very positive and wants additional evidence. Finally, reviewer 2 is much more negative. They say the manuscript just does not make a significant new theoretical breakthrough. And my response to that would have been, well, we weren't saying that we were making a new theoretical breakthrough, but I guess, in the top journal, they want you to be doing that constantly. So, to establish the importance of the results, it's necessary to consider and hopefully demonstrate the longevity of the effects, blah, blah, blah. We had only shown these effects up to the point where our data was available, so It was not what they wanted, although like the data that they were asking for did not exist. I know you will find this to be a disappointing outcome, but I think there's good reason for optimism. All the readers agree that you have an interesting and important set of findings here. Even though there are questions about the theoretical implications and temporal stability of the results, it is clear that the analysis is useful for understanding public reactions to the 2008 election. As such, I believe this paper would have an excellent chance of publication in a more focused outlet. And this paragraph, it seems really nice, but it is all like very, I can't think of the word, very patronizing, actually. That, hey, you still did a good job. And at the very end, as such, I believe this paper would have an excellent chance of publication in a more focused outlet. That is them saying, your paper does not belong in this journal, the top journal. That is very general in its scope because everybody wants to submit to it. More focused outlet means like a less prestigious subfield type journal, which, I don't necessarily disagree with them. That, when this was one of the first papers that I tried to get published, and when my co-author was like, let's submit it to this journal, I was like, do you think we're really going to get published there? They were like, well, maybe, but it doesn't hurt to try. So, this is not the worst outcome in the world. And, there were other kind of smarmy, not so great things that this guy had in his decision letter to us. And he actually, well, I always struggle if I should include this part or not, talking about this, but this guy was somebody who was using his position of power at this journal to coerce people to do things that they may not have wanted to do, or definitely didn't want to do. And then he got publicly called out for these things, and then used the journal website to refute people's claims that he was a sexual harasser. So I don't know. I feel okay having a disagreement with this person. So anyway. Now you see why I wasn't sure if I should say that or not. Now, every semester I think, should I say this? Probably not. Anyway, a different outcome that's more positive that you might get on a submission is like this one, revise and resubmit, remember? This was, I believe, for that same paper. The reviewers and I have read your article carefully. While I cannot accept your article for publication in its current form based on my reading and recommendations from the reviewers, I would like to invite you to submit a revised version. The reviews can be found at the end of this letter. From these comments, you see that a number of specific points will need to be addressed. My final decision will depend on these points, blah, blah, blah. It is especially important that you should include in your cover letter an itemized explanation of your decisions about how you've dealt with these comments. So, good action editors will tell you, these are the important things that the reviewers want, and this is me giving you a clear signal. I want you to do this, this, and this, and you can ignore everything else the reviewers said. A lot of times, though, they don't do that. And so you have reviewers that are telling you all these things that might or might not be good ideas, and then your cover letter has to have a seriously itemized list of reviewer 2 said this. We think that is a bad idea, so we didn't do it for X, Y, and Z reasons. Or reviewer 3 said we should change this terminology, so we have on pages 3, 7, and 9. So sometimes your cover letter, where you're explaining all these decisions, is 15 pages long, which is another real fun process when you are submitting something. Another R&R that I got, this one was one that had to do with, this was one that had to do with eyewitness testimony stuff. As you will see, all three of us were enthusiastic about this work. At the same time, as you might expect, questions and concerns were raised as well. I've recommended that major revisions be made to your manuscript in order to consider publication. So, even though they say major revisions, it's still, a positive outcome that they want us to try to do more. Before highlighting the major issues, let me first state, without making any explicit promises, that I do see a path forward for this manuscript to reach a stage of publication. So what they were getting at here is that we needed to do a whole nother study in addition to the one that we had already completed, to show them that these findings were, more reliable, which we thankfully did successfully. Sometimes they're not just telling you, you need to change your terminology, you should do a different analysis, whatever. They're saying, like, hey, we're going to give you like 6 months, do another study, and show us that this thing you're talking about is real. So hopefully these kind of give you a sense of what the different possible outcomes are here when you submit a paper and the types of feedback that you might get. So when you actually get these reviews, though, what do they look like? And how should you, as a reviewer, be writing them? You guys, or you all, kind of know this at this point from doing the peer review assignment or having almost completed the peer review assignment. I say that because as I'm recording this, several of you have already submitted your reviews, but many of you might be finishing them after you listen to this. But what they should look like, hopefully, is you have a brief summary of what the true findings are about. And that, in a sense, is really just reassuring the action editor and the authors that you have carefully read the paper and that you understand it and you know the main points. So just showing that you've done your homework. Then things go in like descending order of importance. You bring up your major concerns, things that, maybe have to do with an analysis being done wrong, or you think that the design is not sufficient to support the claims that somebody is making, or that they're interpreting their data wrong. Like, big problems should be brought up in the major concerns part. Minor concerns could run the gamut from everything about, why don't you cite X, Y, and Z authors, or why are you defining this term that way, things like that. And then at the end, if you're a really nice reviewer, you might point out smaller errors to people. Not everybody does this, again, and, the authors should have been catching these things themselves already, so it's not really their responsibility, but, it's nice to have these things pointed out. One, kind of sidetrack thing to mention, one really good comment that I got on a paper, and something that you've probably seen in feedback on your papers now at this point, or you might soon if you haven't gotten your feedback on results and discussion yet. The way that you talk about statistics, it needs to be really precise, and there are some misleading things about the way that we phrase conclusions in statistics sometimes. One of those things is using phrases around the terms involved in statistical significance. So one comment that I got was, lastly, for all that is holy, please never use the phrase highly significant that adds a certain value judgment to a particular statistic that is unstable and meaningless outside of context. The relationship is merely significant, not highly or hardly, just significant. And I, have never forgotten this piece of advice that I've gotten from someone that I don't know who they are, from an anonymous reviewer, and I don't know, I just wanted to highlight that because sometimes you get feedback in these reviews that stick with you even through to other papers, and this is really important, and it's something that's going to come up as we talk about replication and questionable research practices in a bit. That the way we talk about statistics really matters, and we need to understand them and be able to communicate them clearly. And saying highly significant, like, again, yeah, I mean, this is something I knew, but I didn't think about it as I wrote this paper, that highly significant is not a meaningful way to describe something. Just because your p-value is really low, it doesn't mean like your effect matters more, so it's kind of a misleading way to say it. Other than, just to kind of wrap up talking about publication, other ways that you might communicate your findings, besides a journal article, there are lots of other ways to do this. Usually to communicate them widely and in a way that's going to matter for your job security as a researcher, you need to get publications. But there are other ways that you might convey the same research at an earlier stage. I've talked a little bit here and there about conferences that people go to. to share their findings. These are a really important way to get feedback and meet people, meet potential collaborators. You kind of have two options at these conferences: that you submit what we call a paper presentation or a talk, where you get maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes to talk about your paper and your findings, and sort of tell the story of them. And usually you're like, either you've submitted a themed set of talks with other people, or you submit one just by yourself and it's put together into a themed symposium of other talks together. It's giving a PowerPoint presentation basically about your research. The availability of giving these types of talks depends a lot on the size and prestige of the conference you're going to. If you're going to a conference that has 5 or 10,000 people, there probably are lots of paper sessions, presentation sessions, but there are also tons and tons and tons of attendees, and not everybody can give a paper. But usually for people to get funding to go to conferences, whether you're a grad student or faculty member, you need to be presenting something. And usually this comes in, for most people, comes in the form of a poster presentation. Poster presentations, if you aren't familiar with them, sometimes Tulane has them for students in different capacities, but at these big conferences, it's like one I went to even in New Orleans this past February, SPSP, Society for Personality and Social Psychology. They have sessions of 200 to 250 posters going on at once, where it's just a bunch of those big fabric boards where you pin up your poster, and people walk around and they look at it and they hopefully read it and ask you some questions, and it's kind of awkward, but sometimes you have some really fascinating conversations out of it. So that is the much more numerous option that more early career people and grad students are more likely to be doing. Outside of journals and conferences, there are other ways that you might communicate your results. More and more often, people are kind of informally sharing their results on blogs, whether it's their own blog for their lab or some kind of bigger blog associated with some publication or society, like SPSP, that society that I just mentioned, whose conference I went to. They have a new blog called Character and Context, which is just, they invite people that have interesting work to talk about it and connect it to things going on in the world. So that's another way to kind of communicate relatively informally things about your work, even though ideally you're also going to conferences and publishing actual papers. Other things that tend to happen, popular media coverage of people's work, getting interviewed, or getting some kind of profile on your work, whether it's in like a school newspaper or even a national publication or somewhere in between. That definitely happens, but that usually happens after you've published it in a journal, that someone would contact you to talk about these sorts of things. Before you've published it, how do people know, right? So usually it's kind of after the fact. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for this one, and I will resume next time talking about how all this stuff plays into a kind of destructive incentive structure in psychology.